All registered participants will be notified how to access the recording as well as the speakers' presentations. All the participants, you are more than welcome to ask questions, share your thoughts and comments at any point during our event. But if they are not addressed immediately by the speaker, I would like to remind you that after each presentation, there will be a dedicated Q&A time. My name is Anne Matczak. I'm a researcher at the Center of Expertise on Global Governance and lecturer in comparative criminology at the Hague University of Applied Sciences, where I teach criminology-related courses in a BSc program called Safety and Security Management Studies. And this event is organized in cooperation with my colleague, Dr. Juri Mathis, who's assistant professor at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University. You will hear from Juri later on today when he will summarize the presentations and conclude our event. And I also welcome you on behalf of our research assistant, Dillon Ashmore. Many of you, if not all of you, have been in touch with Dillon at some point, and he's our third-year SSMS student and vice president of our study association called Centuria. By way of introduction, let me say a few words how the idea for the seminar originated and what is the purpose we are meeting today. So about 2.5 years ago, before the pandemic, when we were able to meet freely, we were organizing on a regular basis internal research launch seminars in SSMS, and our colleague Ben Leunke, in one of these research launch seminars, shared his reflections on the book called Safety Crimes, the book by Steve Thomps and David White, which not only sparked a very interesting discussion about the work safety violations amongst my colleagues in SSMS, but also contributed to the way I teach my minor called Crime, Safety and Security, where the concept of safety crimes has become part of a weekly theme on corporate crime. And last summer, Juri and I teamed up to discuss our research interests, but also the topics in the field of safety and security that, in our view, deserve more scholarly and professional attention. And the criminalization of safety deficiencies or human error, if you like, was definitely one of them. We applied for a small research grant to address some of these gaps, and today's event is a result of our successful application for this grant. More on a personal note, and I know that there are some SSMS and Leiden students with us today. Ever since I joined SSMS, I've been wondering how better explain the role of criminology in the field of safety and security, how criminology can assist safety and security professionals to do a better job. And the three speakers for today's seminar have been very inspirational. Their scholarship has been extremely inspirational to find some answers to this question. At both universities, the Hague University of Applied Sciences and Leiden University, we teach safety and security from a highly interdisciplinary perspective. At both universities, we extensively collaborate and network with a wide range of professionals in the field. And we also observe the growth of our students. And in SSMS, what is of particular interest to me is to see what students do in their final year when, while they're working on their 6-month-long internship. They also work on a research thesis problem that most of the time comes from the professional field itself and is supposed to bring a solution to the internship organization. Many of these topics consider, of course, general crime prevention, but also safety culture, the concept of safety culture, incident reporting, safety awareness training, multi-agency collaboration between police or other public safety organizations. So in our teaching, in our thesis supervision, research activities, we are continuously challenged with a number of questions, and many of them will guide this seminar today. And let me remind you some of them. They were also included in the description of this event. What is the role and limits of criminal law in relation to safety matters? what is the nature and the extent of the involvement of criminal justice actors, including the police, in response to these issues, how to establish criminal intent, criminal negligence in safety-related investigations, how does the concept of safety crimes, the introduction of safety crimes impact or can impact the creation and development of safety culture in an organization. And last but not least, how should we approach safety deficiencies? Should they be more regulated or criminalized? So these questions, I hope that we will hear some answers to some of these questions today from our fantastic speakers who were very generous with their time and commitment to this event. And I will now introduce the all three of them. So the first speaker, Professor Steve Thomps, whose book, as you now know, planted the seed for this event many years ago, is Professor of Criminology at the Open University in the United Kingdom. He has a long-standing interest in the incidence and nature and regulation of corporate and state crime and harm. He has long work with the hazards movement and the Institute of Employment Rights, and is trustee and a board member of Inquest. He has published extensively in relation to the enforcement of environmental, food, occupational health and safety law, the impacts and potential of a social harm perspective, but also the limitations of the mainstream criminology in relation to these topics. And along with David White, Professor David White, he has worked and continues to work on various academic and policy-oriented engagements in relation to health and safety, environmental regulations. Our next speaker will be Professor Anne Alvesalo-Kuusi, who's based at the University of Turku in Finland. From 1996 to 2007, she worked as a senior researcher at the Police College of Finland, and until 2010, she held a similar position in the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health. She has studied and published extensively in the area of economic and corporate crime control and criminal policy. Her areas of interest also include the critical analysis of lawmaking. She's the European editor of Journal of White Collar and Corporate Crime. And our third speaker, Professor Gabriele Landucci, is currently Associate Professor of Chemical Engineering at the University of Pisa in Italy. And in 2018, he was Associate Professor of Safety at Leiden University. His research and teaching activities focus on industrial safety and risk assessment in the framework of chemical and process industries. He's currently associate editor of the Journal of Loss Prevention in the Process Industries and the Journal of Integrated Security Science. He's also co-chair of the Technical Committee in Chemical and Process Industry of the European Safety and Reliability Association. So now I would like to just give the floor to our first speaker, Professor Steve Thomps, and after that we will have a short Q&A, and then we'll proceed to the second and then the third presentation. Thank you very much. Welcome everyone, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your contributions to this event. Thank you. Steve, we can't hear you now, or maybe it's only me.
No, it's not just you.
Okay.
Put the microphone, Steve, it's on the left. When you scroll down, it's on the left.
Yes, you are muted indeed.
It's just next to the stop video. At the bottom of the screen, the first.
There you go.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Apologies for that, folks. But look, it wouldn't be an online meeting without some fool not unmuting themselves. So, look, thanks to Anna and to Dillon for the invitation and for all the organisational work, and thanks to Anna for that very generous introduction. And thanks, of course, to all of you for coming along today. And as Anna said, I work in the UK, so I'm going to speak from the British context. I say Britain because the data and the policies covered Scotland, Wales, and England. They don't cover Northern Ireland, so it's Britain and not the UK. Obviously, I'm speaking to a European audience, so we can have a dialogue. What I want to say today comes in four uneven parts, really. I'm going to say something about the current state of safety or the lack of safety in Britain. I'm going to talk about the emergence of an initiative around regulation called Better Regulation, which I think will be familiar to many of you in an EU context. I'm going to say something thirdly about trends in enforcement, particularly since 2010, so over the past decade or so. And then I'm going to make a very specific reference at the end to what's been happening to safety law enforcement during COVID, during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'll just kind of make a concluding observation around decriminalisation. So firstly, just to give some very, very broad overview data about the state of safety, or in fact, the lack of safety, injuries and ill health and deaths and so on in British workplaces. This is data from the Health and Safety Executive, which is the national regulator in this context. Its most recent statistics were published in 2020. We'd expect the 2021 data to be out any day now. So they usually come out by the end of November, but they haven't been published yet. So we can see that there were just over 111 fatal injuries to workers in Great Britain in the last recording year. About 13,000 deaths linked to exposures at work. About 5,000 of those were due to asbestos, but more from other exposures. Close to 750,000 working people took time off work because of an injury at work. That's a self-report survey, but it's run by a government. Nearly 40 million working days lost as a result of poor health and safety at work. And then also just to make the point there, and this is based upon HSE data, that these are kind of health impacts, of course, but they're also financial impacts and economic impacts. So financial impacts borne by individuals who suffer the illness or ill health, or their families where they're bereaved by a death, but also broader financial impacts for employers, government, and therefore an economic impact. 16 billion pounds or 18 billion euros. We need to be wary of some of these figures, right? But what they do underscore is that we are talking about an economic phenomenon as well as a health and safety phenomenon. Now, as you might expect in this area, there's some contestation around the numbers of people who die at work or die as a result, who die related to work or to working each year in Britain. At the top end, we have an estimate by Hilda Palmer and colleagues. The reference is hyperlinked there. If the slides are made available at some point, you can see how she's calculated this, how they've calculated this figure. Hilda Palmer and colleagues reckon there are about 50,000 deaths, or just over 50,000 deaths each year. Again, most of them are occupational exposures. So they're counting in cancers, coronary heart disease, and also suicides, which tend not to appear in official records. The International Labour Organization, for what it's worth, estimate there are about 37,000 deaths a year in the UK, in Great Britain, sorry. However we look at it, economically and in terms of health and death and injury, we're talking about a significant scale of social harm, I think, in this sphere. So that's just some kind of the first thing I was going to do, just some overview data. The second thing I want to do is to just talk a bit about the emergence and the main contours of an approach to regulation, which is known as better regulation. And it was the kind of birth child of our Social Democratic Party in government from 1997, who called themselves, and it's not the Labour Party at that time, they called themselves New Labour to indicate a break with the past. And the head of the party and became the Prime Minister in 1997 was Tony Blair, of whom you'll have heard, of course. And Tony Blair assumed the presidency of the EU for the first time in 1998. And in his first speech, he talked about regulation. And he introduced the idea of better regulation. He said, in the quote, which may be familiar to you, it's not about more regulation against less regulation. We want to get regulation right. We want better regulation. And also, interestingly, regulation improves, not hinders, business competitiveness. So there's two things to say there, I think, initially. One is that who could object to something being better, right? So we want better regulation. We can all sign up to that in a way. But also, better regulation is linked here not to law enforcement, not to improving the conditions of workers. This is not about health and safety specifically at this point, but about supporting, improving business competitiveness, which is a kind of interesting shift in how we think about regulation. Several years later, the work of all of our national regulators and all of our local authority regulators, I'll come to that distinction in a moment, was reviewed by Sir Philip Hampton, who was the former CEO of a large supermarket, large food store in the UK, produced a report in 2005, endorsed by the then Chancellor, soon to be Prime Minister Gordon Brown, with the kind of the leitmotif, the slogan that regulation should evolve not just a light touch, but a limited touch. And the report and its recommendations for better regulation were based upon a series of assumptions that most businesses are law-abiding for most of the time, that enforcement should be targeted on the small number of businesses who might be willing or predisposed towards breaking the law, and that reforming regulation and enforcing regulation less, enforcing the law less, were necessary to a growing economy. So the kind of the link between regulation and improving business competitiveness now becomes embedded in regulatory policy in Great Britain. Now, an awful lot of work was then put in over, well, that was 2005, so in the last 15, 16 years, an awful lot of work's been put into kind of cementing better regulation as the dominant way of thinking about and doing regulation in Britain. And in a book which I wrote a few years ago, I'm going to hold it up, The End of Social Protection, I spent quite a lot of time talking about these different processes, all of which worked in the same way, which was to make better regulation instinctual almost, for those who talked about regulation, who developed policy around regulation, and importantly for those who enforced regulation across various inspectorates. We're still talking more broadly than health and safety. We're talking about regulation in general at this point. Now, in 2010, the political administration in Britain changed so that the new Labour government lost the election shortly after the global financial crisis. And in 2010, we had a Conservative-led coalition and then a Conservative-led government still in charge today under Prime Minister Johnson. And they took some of these kind of better regulation trends and they really, in the context of austerity, post-global financial crisis, trying to reduce public expenditure and seeking economic recovery through less regulation, have really kind of turbocharged some of these processes. And I'll just mention them very, very briefly, the four things. So we've had a kind of long-term rhetoric, which has been opposed to regulation, which has seen regulation of business as a burden, as red tape, of getting in the way of competitiveness. Paul Armand's talked about this in articles around hanging baskets and so on. A lot of this is tied up with anti-European, or was tied up with anti-European Union sentiment. So it was seen that kind of burdens and regulations particularly made their way into British businesses via European Union European Union law. So we see a whole series of very high-profile speeches about regulation, but particularly in this rhetoric, health and safety becomes the kind of object of particular objection, and indeed in some ways almost of hatred. I think I write about it in this book. Of health and safety regulation becomes the object of hatred. In 2011, new Prime Minister David Cameron gave his first party conference speech as Prime Minister, and he said, this is just after the financial crisis, right, when there's a lot of problems in this country and other countries. He says, quote, "One of the biggest things holding people back is health and safety. I was told recently about a school that wanted to buy a set of highlighter pens. But with the pens came a warning, not so fast. Make sure you comply with the health and safety work regulations, including plenty of fresh air and hand and eye protection. Try highlighting and all that. This isn't how a great nation was built. Britannia didn't rule the waves with armbands on. At long last, we're going to bring common sense back to our country." And a few months later, he gave a speech, a New Year's speech to the country. And he made a New Year's resolution. The coalition has a clear New Year's resolution to kill off the health and safety culture for good. I want 2012 to go down in history, not just as Olympics year or Diamond Jubilee year, but the year we got a lot of this pointless time wasting out of the British economy and out of British life once and for all. So there's a real kind of hatred of regulation develops during this period. There are a whole series of institutions set up within government, which was set up at the heart of government, which looked out at different departments. It meant to ensure that they weren't over-regulating, and indeed to ensure that they were deregulating, removing regulations. I've got a long list of those bodies. I won't read them out now, but in a 4-year period, I came up with about 25 of them that have been established. Obviously, during this period, there's various forms of legal reform. There's deregulation and also re-regulation. And there's also an almost torrent, an endless flow of reviews of regulators. So commissions set up to review the work of regulatory bodies, and here particularly as well, health and safety regulation and the health and safety executive, the main national body that does the regulating in this area, becomes an object of scrutiny. So we move from better regulation in general, but it begins to really hone down and focus in on health and safety regulation as a problem. Yeah, that's the point. It's a problem. It gets in the way of British life and of the British economy. So now I want to turn from talking about regulation in general to, okay, what happened during this period then, particularly the turbocharged period from the end of the last century onwards when the Conservative administration came into power? What happened around health and safety at work enforcement of law? And there are two bodies I want to talk about here. One is the HSE, which I've already mentioned to you. The Health and Safety Executive is the national enforcement agency. But enforcement also takes place at the municipal level through local authorities. I'll talk about those in a moment, but now I'll talk about the National Regulator. Now, here's a bunch of data, again, the most recent data that's available. It goes back over this 10-year period. There's no need for me to go through it line by line, but what you can see is that the trajectories in enforcement are very clear. We have funding falling significantly, total staff falling, numbers of inspectors falling, therefore the numbers of inspections fall significantly, and formal enforcement also then, as you'd expect with all of these kind of outturns and inactivity, formal enforcement also falls. So enforcement takes several kinds in Britain. One is the most common form of law enforcement is where there is violation of health and safety law in a workplace and an inspector comes across it, he or she may decide to issue an enforcement notice, which is called an improvement notice, which requires the law to be complied with within a given period of time. So something within the work or the workplace or the work process has to be changed to ensure compliance with the law by a future agreed date. They're the most common forms of notice. They dropped during this period fairly significantly. The other form of notice which is issued is a prohibition notice, which says that the violation of law is so serious in this context that you have to stop this work process, stop this part of the job, until you can find a way of doing it in a way which does comply with the law. So in a very clear example, here's a machine which requires by law some sort of guarding. There is no guard. You cannot use that machine again until you install legally compliant guard. The most serious, those most serious notices, prohibition notices, fell by over half during this period. And then the kind of most serious end of the enforcement spectrum is, of course, a prosecution. Prosecutions are pretty rare events in any case. At the start of this period, just over 800, just under 900 in a year, but they fell fairly significantly through the year. So there were just over 500 by 2019, 2020. So very clear trends, which is kind of unusual for data about the social world, which is often much messier. By coincidence, the period was very towards the start of the pandemic, here at least, in Britain at least. In March 2020, Martin Temple, who was then chair of the Health and Safety Executive, was giving evidence or was called to a commission on health and safety, a fairly kind of regular review on health and safety in the British Parliament. And as part of his question and answer session that day, he revealed that, I mean, he didn't put it in these terms. Temple actually said, look, we're responsible for about 5.5 million workplaces. We do about 20,000 inspections a year. I know that's not very many. And then if you do that math, then as I put there, in 2020, according to their chair of the HSE, the statistical likelihood of any one employer, duty holder is a technical term, any one employer being inspected by the HSE was 1 in 275. So, put somewhat differently, albeit it's a statistical artifact, any employer could expect to see an inspector once in every 275 years on average. Now, I'll come back to the point about law enforcement later, but that doesn't seem to me to be a credible level of law enforcement. The other level of enforcement of health and safety law is at municipal level or local authorities, which is what this stands for, local authority. So every local region has its own health and safety inspectors, and they tend to undertake health and safety inspections in what are deemed generally lower risk workplace settings, commonly offices, shops, universities. Yeah, they would be the main kind of setting. So retail and office outlets, office work. You can see again, without going through the data in any detail, but you can see again, looking at the data for the same period, that all of the kind of outturns have declined fairly significantly. In some cases, much more significantly than the HSE data, the health and safety executive data. Local authorities refer to visits, not inspections, for a reason I don't understand. I've never known. But in any case, they're the same as they're akin to inspections, equivalent inspections by HSE. They have fallen very significantly during this period. Enforcement notices have fallen. Prohibition notices, the most serious enforcement notices, have fallen. Prosecution is virtually non-existent. So by 2019, 2020, in a country of about 60 million people, 5.5 million businesses, there are 55 prosecutions for violations of the law. Either that means prosecution isn't used very often, or almost all businesses who are regulated here are complying with the law all of the time. The numbers of inspectors, people doing the inspecting, fell across Britain. And 1 in 10 local authorities, there are 353 in England, Wales and Scotland, said they didn't have any full-time person who was a health and safety inspector. So what those bodies are reporting is that most typically they had somebody in post as an inspector who spent part of their working week inspecting health and safety in workplaces and part of their working week inspecting, for example, food safety in food outlets. So they would shift across different regulatory and enforcement functions. But it's a very, very low level of resource, as you can see. Okay, the kind of fourth bit of what I wanted to say here, which is just to kind of bring this up to date and to talk about enforcement during COVID-19. So just by way of context, the first kind of, I don't really like we use the word lockdown a lot in Britain to talk about what happened when people stopped going out to work and cinemas and shops and all that were closed down. It implies that everybody stopped working, stayed at home. Of course, many people didn't stop working. Many people, people in low paid, often classed as unskilled jobs, carried on working and were exposed to dangers in shops, on public transport, as postal workers, refuse collectors in care homes, hospitals, all of those kinds of places, of course. Trains, buses. But formally, people were told to work from home if they could work from home in the third week of March. I think it was around March the 21st in Britain, or actually, in fact, in the UK. And about 7 or 8 weeks later, our Prime Minister announced that he was going to make a speech to the nation on one Sunday evening. I was sitting downstairs, we were having our dinner, and we put the TV on. It's 8 o'clock on Sunday night, and Prime Minister Boris Johnson tells people he wants them to go back to work tomorrow, Monday morning, right? Less than 12 hours later, and that they could feel safe to return to work because there would be COVID-19 secure workplaces. As I said, many people have never left work; they carry on going to work. But many of us in secure middle-class occupations, of course, weren't going to work. We were working from home using technology such as this. And to reassure people who clearly would be reluctant to go back to work, even if it were possible. I mean, most schools in England, at least, were still closed at this point. So for people with children, it wasn't possible just to go back to work the next day. And most people didn't immediately go back to work, by the way. But he said that the health and safety executive will be having spot inspections to ensure that businesses are keeping employees safe. So he recognises the need for existing levels of enforcement to protect workers and indeed members of the public going into workplaces from exposure to and transmission of COVID-19. And in that speech, he said, and it was followed the next day by a speech in Parliament, where he said the same thing. In that address, he said that to ensure the capacity to do the spot inspections, he would be giving, or the government would be giving, £14 million of extra money to the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive. This is the body which over the previous 10 years, if you remember, had lost 121 million in cuts. Right? And now the Prime Minister is saying the government will give, 118 million in cuts. Now the Prime Minister is saying the government will give an extra 14 million to keep workplaces safe from COVID for workers and members of the public. As it subsequently turned out, all was not quite as it seemed. One thing which I don't mention there is that when the 14 million pounds was given to the HSE, but one of the conditions was expressly that it couldn't be spent on new staff for HSE. They couldn't replace some of those staff that had left through 10 years of funding cuts. In fact, the money was there to cover what was called spot check inspections, which weren't in fact inspections. They were 3 stages, which I outline here, which I'll speak through in a moment. They were also inspections which couldn't be carried out by HSE staff, but had to be subcontracted, outsourced to private contractors. So these were people who were typically in call centres, who had no experience or expertise in the area of health and safety law, let alone COVID-19. In fact, the 2 main companies were debt recovery companies, companies recovering losses from bankrupt individuals and companies, actually, for whatever reason. And they carried out these so-called spot check inspections in 3 stages. So the first stage was that they would go through a questionnaire. They would phone up, say to the employer, is your workplace ventilated? What kind of ventilation does it have? What access to hand hygiene do your employees have? And so on and so forth. And they would literally tick the boxes on the checklist. And in most cases, most companies didn't go, most inspections, so to speak, didn't go past stage 1. Where, however, answers weren't satisfactory, an employer might say, well, we're not exactly sure about the level of ventilation, we open the windows when we can, then that might be followed up by what's called a conversation. This is from HSE's own guidance, a conversation delving into any areas of potential concern. So there may be a follow-up to the scripted telephone call. And if that still left some concerns, at this point, an HSE inspector, now not the subcontractor, would pay a visit to the company who had been telephoned twice and have a spot check visit. So although this is all called spot check visits, while there were 15,000 calls, they generated only about 4,000, or just under 5,000 visits during this period. The outturn of all of this was that in the first year, by April 2021, all of that enforcement activity, those 15,000 phone calls, those 5,000 spot checks, had generated 78 notices. 78 notices had been imposed upon employers for breaching COVID secure guidelines, despite the fact that we know that there were thousands of outbreaks and COVID clusters in workplaces across Britain that documented. Also, by this point, by April 2021, there hadn't been a single prosecution against an employer related to breaches of COVID-19 regulations, not one. And as far as I know, there still hasn't been any. You can contrast that by April 2021 in Britain, as in all of your countries, I'm sure. Of course, we had, as the pandemic emerged, We had a whole series of restrictions which were introduced in terms of our movement and our activities, which were enforceable by law. I think that's the case in most, not all countries. So in Britain, there were restrictions on who could come into your house, how often you could go outside. You could go outside to exercise for 1 hour a day at the start of the pandemic. You couldn't have members of other households into your home. You couldn't meet in groups in parks or in public spaces. You had to wear masks in certain places. And compliance with those regulations was in the hands of the police. And while there have been no prosecutions of businesses in the first year of these regulations, there have been over 85,000 instant fines issued to members of the public for breaking COVID regulations. So businesses completely law-abiding, members of the public were subject to fairly heavy, one might say also legitimate, policing and regulation of their movements. During this year, HSE inspectors only conducted just over 400 regular inspections. So that inspection activity, their routine work virtually dropped from that about 20,000 inspections a year that Martin Temple referred to down to 400. The point to make then is that as Britain's workplaces became dangerous, they became sites of transmission of fatal virus. The HSE virtually disappeared. It disappeared from routine inspections, and it disappeared behind outsourced private contractors in terms of COVID work for the most part. It's notable for its absence. So 3 very brief conclusions then, which are, won't be surprising for me to say based upon what I've said so far. I mean, I think in terms of the data that I began with, a lot of the kind of the hidden ill health and the hidden deaths from ill health, not least. Despite the numbers of fatal injuries now being 111, that's relatively low, widespread workplace harm, including death from illness, is the norm in Great Britain, although it's not really talked about very much. In my own view, I don't think the health and safety executive nor local authorities as regulators are any more fit for purpose. I don't think the levels of inspection and enforcement make them credible. I think if you are going to see, look, I often use this analogy talking to students. It's that when we go on a bus, or a train, we have to buy a ticket. We buy a ticket because we're law-abiding, some of us, and we buy a ticket because we could afford it, some of us. But we also buy it because we think we might be asked to show it, and if we don't show it, we may be in trouble. Right? And I think of that statistic, which is the average employer can expect to see an inspector once every 275 years. Now, if I knew that the chance of an inspector asking me for my bus ticket was only going to happen once every 275 years, on average, I would stop buying a ticket, because the regulations around tickets would lack credibility because they weren't being enforced. I think it's analogous here. We've got law. We've still got lots of health and safety law. In some respects, we've got very good health and safety law, but it's not enforced. And if you have law without enforcement, which was the subtitle of this book, then I think health and safety in British workplaces, to return directly to the theme of the seminar, has been effectively decriminalised, particularly in the last 10 years. And now I'll stop. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Steve, for this first presentation and for sharing the overview from the United Kingdom. I'm trying to see whether there are any comments in the chat, or maybe if some of you would like to ask a question directly, please feel free to do so. You can unmute yourself, you can also switch on your video, but you can also share your question, your comment in the chat box, and I will read it out on your behalf if that's what you prefer. In the meantime, I was wondering whether the concept of safety crimes during a human emergency now is seen from a different perspective. It's a very gloomy and pessimistic perspective, but is that a new reality for safety crimes, or is that a lesson that has never been learned?
Anna, just very quickly before,
Yes.
I would like to ask the people who are putting in questions to put it in the general chat, so not to send the question directly to Steve, so everybody can see the question as well. Right.
Oh, very good point. Okay. I see a question from Roger. I mean, an indication that Roger would like to ask a question. I will give you the floor in a second. If you can, maybe perhaps Steve, just address my first kind of worry over the concept. Is that a new reality for this for safety crimes, or is this a lesson that has never been learned?
Yeah, excuse me, that's a really interesting question, because I think some of us who are interested in the area of safety crimes and health and safety work more generally, we were meeting at the start of the pandemic in here, at least. And one of the things we were saying was that this, of course, it's awful, and it's been particularly awful in Britain, where we've had over 150,000 people have died. Right? But one, you might say, silver lining was that this finally might bring together and understand, bring to the fore an understanding that workplace health and safety, and particularly workplace health, is also public health, and actually vice versa. But that's never really come to pass. In work, the extent of transmission and exposure at work has occasionally attracted public profile. The extent of school transmission, actually, interestingly, although schools are workplaces, of course, but the nature of schools as sites of transmission, so children taking COVID back into the home, and children not being affected, but of course detrimentally affecting their parents and grandparents. That's been a public issue. Workplaces haven't really been a public issue. I mean, and we talk about workplaces as if they're somewhere separate, and we thought that separation might dissolve. But if we talk about shops and cinemas, schools, care homes, buses, trains, they're all places that we use as consumers, but they're all places of work as well. They're all workplaces. So the public health, the workplace health distinction doesn't really work anymore, but it's kind of been maintained. It's been maintained because the places where people have carried on working have simply not been an object of political nor much public scrutiny. So in that respect, I think those of us who take this kind of area seriously, we've kind of failed in many respects, right? Because one of the things we try to do is to say, well, workplace health is public health, and that message hasn't gotten across. And so I think sorry, I'll finish now, but in a sense, we're now in a worse state than we were in a couple of years ago, because we've now almost accepted that low-paid, what are called unskilled retail workers, it's just okay if they're 7 times more likely to die, in this case of COVID, than people in other occupations. That's just okay. It's become almost acceptable. The same for bus and taxi drivers. Very high rates of exposure to COVID, death, and it's just kind of okay. So in a sense, we've accepted that some people in some occupations matter less, really, and that's of course tragic.
Thank you very much, Steve. Roger, now it's your time to ask a question. If I might just introduce Roger Wang, he's also one of the SSMS lecturers, and he's the course convener for also one of our minors called Safety Risk and Safety Compliance. Roger, would you like to ask your question directly?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much, Steve, for that very interesting presentation of all the statistics of the HSE in UK. I'll be honest with you, I'm quite surprised and astonished because I come from Suriname, a country where we have little HSE regulations and where enforcement of those small amount of regulation is little to not done. And within the industry I come from, that is oil and gas, where I worked for 10 years, the NIBOSH, the IOSH, those are the first references for us as HSE professionals, which originally come from the UK. So my impression was that HSE is being managed in the best way in the UK. But when I look at the statistics you're giving, it's quite maybe the opposite. I think the most important thing that I could conclude is that the issue lies with enforcement of the laws. I think there are enough laws, but the enforcement of it. But I have some small questions. I hope you can help me with that. First of all, If you compare the statistics that you've just shown regarding the reduction in, enforcement and a number of other characteristics regarding HSC laws, do you see a correlation in the amount of accidents, incidents being reported on the work floor? And of course, you know, that correlation can be also difficult to interpret it, because is it because things aren't being reported, or because there's no enforcement that people are just not notifying the government of it? That is one of them. And also, what is the cause to the reduction in those numbers regarding enforcement and all other ways of ensuring that laws are abided by the industry? What is caused? Has it been politics or the focus? And you mentioned the name Health and Safety Executive. Do you mean the Health and Safety Executive of companies, or what do you mean there with that term? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Roger. So there's quite a lot there. If I forget to answer, you'll tell me, right? If I forget to answer the constituent bits.
Sure.
The first thing to say is that look, I think I made this point earlier as well. In many respects, so the Health and Safety Work Act, which is the framework legislation, as you'll know, was passed in 1974 in Great Britain, and it was that body which set up the Health and Safety Executive. So to answer your last question first, the Health and Safety Executive is a national public enforcement agency. It's established. Yep, and it consists of different inspectorates. So there's what used to be called the Factories Inspectorate. There used to be the Mines Inspectorate. There's a Nuclear Inspectorate, Chemicals Inspectorate. It has an overarching management board, research function, and so on. But it's a national public agency.
Okay.
The 1974 Health and Safety Work Act, which set that agency up and also set up the framework of law, is in many respects really good law. It's very robust. It's still a very robust law. And I think rightly has been, Britain had a good reputation for health and safety because of that law. And we do have good safety professionals, and we do have some good training, such as NEBOS, which you refer to. But I also think that there's now something of a myth, really, about there's something of you'll be unsurprised, because many Britons are very arrogant, and we have an arrogance about our health and safety system, that it's one of the best in the world. And I just don't think that holds up anymore. We're the 5th largest economy, and we probably don't have the 5th best health and safety system in the world. Although we may have had one of the best at one point. I think it really has been. A political turn against health and safety law and enforcement. And I made this point in passing, but I didn't emphasize it enough. This first emerged, so the Act comes in 74 and looks robust, and resources are increasing in its early years. And then in 1979, we had a government under somebody called Mrs. Thatcher, which was a kind of, the right-wing government, first neoliberal government in Western Europe, followed then by Reagan in the States, of course, in 1980. She first set about this anti-health and safety regulation rhetoric. And she tried, in 1985, she had a series of proposals to remove lots of health and safety regulations and rewrite the Health and Safety Work Act. And despite having a large majority, she failed. There was pushback in the country, and there was pushback in Parliament, and it never went through. And it kind of re-emerged in the early 90s. And the context in which it re-emerged was opposition to the European Union. The European Union was seen as a source of what is often referred to as gold-plating regulation. More regulation was necessary. The European Union became objects of jokes about regulation. So there was a joke in wide circulation, which was shops had to sell bananas, or had to throw bananas away because they didn't fit the regulations about the right shape or the right size. Now, these things were very powerful. And I mentioned Paul Armand. He's a social legal scholar who's written about these in books and articles. So I think the politics was very much tied up with opposition to membership of the European Union, and we all know where that ended up, right? We ended up in Brexit, because that gathered a momentum. And it was both parties of the so-called party of the left as well as the party of the right. And in that respect, it made opposition to that anti-regulation, anti-health and safety, and anti-European Union sentiment. Very difficult to oppose.
Steve, can I just jump in there? Where was
yeah.
where are the unions in that then? Because the unions are the ones that's supposed to look after the rights and also the safety of the people working in companies. Don't they have a strong position, or were they just agreeing with what the politicians are saying?
No, the formal positions of unions has been and remains one of opposition. But of course, during this period, again, going back to 1974, when union membership was about 80% of workers in this country, it's now less than 30%. So unions are much weaker than they once were. Cucumbers, yeah, and bananas as well, actually. But anyway, and then many workplaces which don't have union membership, any union members or union representations, and the workplaces which would, the sectors which were really dominated by unions, were also the ones which were very dangerous, like heavy manufacturing, chemicals, heavy engineering, some construction, shipbuilding, the mining industry. They're all mostly gone from Britain now. Hence, they're almost gone. There's no mining industry, for example. Mines were the most dangerous places to work. There's no mining in this country anymore. So the numbers of deaths from fatal injuries have gone down, of course. But also the power of unions has diminished during that period, and health and safety was a good recruit. So the unions have been appropriate. The unions are pretty weak, and I speak as someone who works with unions. The last thing to say is, it's not possible, I think, to make a correlation between what's happening with enforcement and what's happening with numbers of incidents, injuries, cases of ill health, for precisely the reasons that you mentioned. Levels of reporting are both so low, probably not deaths for reasons you'd expect, but they're still not all deaths are reported. But levels of reporting are so low and inconsistently low that it's very difficult to make any kind of tie-up or correlation between the kind of trends I talked about and the extent of danger and the effects of risk in the workplace.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. I think you answered all my questions. Anna, just a comment. I saw my hands being clapped constantly and I'm not doing anything. So maybe you can check that, please. But otherwise, people will think, what is wrong with Roger?
No, I think
he's a very happy guy.
That was very good. I'm very pleased.
Thank you. I tried to investigate this, but I don't think that I know what was the issue. I really don't know why this popped up, but I'm sorry. But thank you for clarifying this. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for your answers, Steve. And let's move on now to our second speaker. So we stay on the schedule. So now let me invite Professor Anne Alvesalo-Kuusi to give the second presentation. I'm not sure whether Steve has to first take down his presentation, or can we just share yours immediately? I'm not familiar with WebEx that well, so.
Yeah, I think I said that I can't find any way of stopping sharing my presentation.
Okay.
So what I'll do is I'll leave the meeting and I'll come straight back in, and then it should be hand over to Anne. That seems the easiest way to do it, and I won't hold Anne.
Okay, if that helps, then yes. Okay, but please come back.
Yeah, of course I will. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I'm trying to share. Yeah. Okay. Can you see my presentation now?
Yes, we can. You just have to put it in the full mode, and that would be perfect.
Okay. Is it now?
Not yet.
I think you have to put it in a windowed mode, because if you put it to full mode, now it goes to full screen. But perhaps if you minimize just the things on the left, we can follow it like this as well.
So like this is okay? Can you see now the policing and punishing?
Yes. Well, it's fine. Yeah.
We see the first page. We actually see the entire.
Okay.
So we also see the rest.
If this is okay, I continue with this. Okay. Okay. So hello everybody. Greetings from Finland. It's about -20 degrees and it's getting dark already now. We have about 6 hours of sunshine here, so it would have been very nice to come to The Hague, where I have lived actually 1 year when I studied critical criminology in Rotterdam. And thank you for inviting me here to talk about my studies, which are what I will talk about today is about policing and punishing safety crime, and this presentation is based on two studies, one on policing, one on punishing and imposing corporate fines and corporate criminal liability to corporations. So these are based on my empirical studies, what I'm going to talk about. These are separate studies, but addressing the same theme. And I'll start with policing, the study on policing, and I will talk about the police perceptions of safety crime and their investigation. But to orientate you into this theme of policing safety crime, in Finland, the police has the main responsibility to investigate safety crimes. So as Steve explained, in Britain, it's the health and safety inspectors who bear the main responsibility, but in Finland, it's the police, together, of course, with the health and safety inspectors, but they are leading the investigations. So when you look at this, in these instructions about how police instructs the public to make a report of an offense, how the act was committed, where it and at what time, give a description of the perpetrator's physical appearance, age, height, body shape, facial features, and so on. In which direction did the possible perpetrator flee? What kind of car he or she used? Was she or he intoxicated or making threats, etc. So you can see very clearly that this type of construction of crime by the police is very traditional. So it's totally useless for making a report of an offense if we talk about corporate crime. So these perceptions of crime are based on the ideas that crime is an observable incident which happens in a certain narrow time frame, in a certain place, exact time, and that an individual commits this crime, that there is a guilty mind, and that there is a clear chain of cause and effect in this narrow time frame, and that there is a motive for committing the crime. So these common sense assumptions about crime, assumptions also that the police and what we generally have, they are closely linked to criminal doctrine. Of course, we know that criminal law has changed, and there is in many jurisdictions, corporate criminal liability. It's not anymore totally about that individuals are the only ones who can be seen as perpetrators or sanctions, but the traditional criminal doctrine, the thought of individual guilt, is very strong, even though these changes have happened, and they provide also a conceptual framework for how safety crimes are perceived and understood. So safety crimes, I guess I don't have to repeat the definition, but so I guess it's all familiar because this is the topic of this seminar. But just to remind that they are violations of law by employers which have the potential, which cause or have the potential to cause sudden death or injury. So in the Finnish Penal Code, we have had since 1995 criminalization called work safety crime. And when you look at these essential elements on the right side, we can say here that the law is quite good. I mean, it's easily applicable to many incidents. So if an employer violates work safety regulations, causes a defect or fault, which is contrary to work safety regulations, or fails to provide financial prerequisites for work safety, this fulfills the definition of work safety crime. So there shouldn't be any problem implementing this criminalization. When you look at the safety crimes in the criminal justice system, this figure tells us, well, it doesn't tell, of course, about how much safety crimes happen, but we are looking at now those that go to the criminal justice system. So the police are filed over 1,200 incidents of neglecting safety at work. But only a small proportion, over 200, are defined as possible crimes. So the police has this category of crime reports, the 216, and then they have this S reports, which comes from the word sekalaiset miskälinnes. So those that are defined as not crime. So we can already see here that only a small proportion of the incidents reported proceed in the criminal justice system. So I will move on to this study now, where I looked at these incidents reported to the police. I did interviews and a survey. We saw some figures there, but I will now tell a bit about what the police, how the police perceived safety crime and their investigation. So firstly, it was very clear that the interviews, and these were police who had been involved in safety crime investigation, of course. Well, they said that there is no action. They are not active crimes. And that's why they are not real crimes or interesting crimes. They also defined the suspects as not real criminals. They are not awfully criminal. We are dealing with normal people, unlike the usual suspects, who they defined as piles of shit, and that they don't really look like criminals, which of course reflect this very stereotypical idea that the police have of what is a real criminal. Also, what was quite clear is that the reason why they couldn't be, the police didn't define these as crimes, was victim blaming. So it was thought that it's very often the reason of the victim, or the victim takes the blame. And this was seen in the interviews when the police said that it's not the responsibility of the employer if some idiot blunders by oneself. And also you could see this in the interviews, but you could also see in the police reports, which was my empirical data. Okay. Was there some problem? Okay. And the contributory negligence of the victim was emphasized in many reports, in many interviews and reports. Also, the incidents were defined often as accidents, and as you saw in the graphics, and that they were registered as non-crimes or bad luck and coincidence. So this was actually when the police were asked in the interviews to define what is a typical case. It's about bad luck, or then they talked a lot about how the individual is to blame here, takes a sidestep. And what is interesting here, that one investigator pointed out that it took me 3 years before I understood these are crimes, not accidents. Also, the policing of safety crime was defined as worthless or even deviant. So it was bad luck if you get such a pile of puke on your hands. And it was thought that this type of investigation suits best for those who are near their pensioning age or for pregnant women, because they don't involve action, central element of police culture when they define what is real police work. And this was interesting, that the police who investigated safety crimes said that they have to be careful. You cannot be too enthusiastic about these, because you can be labeled as a leftist. You are easily labeled. And then again, there were these few exceptions in thinking about safety crime. About one interview said that he liked these cases. It fits his character because he's a radical and an environmentalist, a non-conformist, as he defined himself. And he thought that this kind of mindset you need in order to successfully investigate these cases. And then lastly, what was interesting was the denial of corporate benefit, that there was not an understanding that there could be some kind of economic interest in not taking care of safety issues. It was about the hurry, they said. It's not neglecting, but it's about the hurry. And this also exemplifies the narrow time frame thinking, that it's not thought like beyond the hurry. Why is there the hurry? Because there is not enough people looking over safety, health and safety at the workplace. So also, the concept of corporate criminal liability was unknown to many of the police I interviewed. And now I'll move to the study on corporate criminal liability, where we did two types of analysis. Firstly, we analyzed the legislative process of corporate criminal liability, how it became. And then we analyzed all cases where a corporate fine was convicted of safety crime between 2010 and 14, and I will concentrate on the latter. Corporate criminal liability in Finland means that a corporation can be punished up to 850,000 euros if a crime has been committed in that corporation. So the law bases on the idea that punishing corporations the wrongdoings of the managers, I mean that they wanted to stress that the culpability and liability should lie where the actual decisions are made. So on the top brass and the corporation. So this was the idea behind corporate criminal liability, or the argumentation of this legal change. And the short history here in one slide of this legislation, that the history was actually quite long. It took 22 years before this law was passed. So it started in 73, and the penal code was criticized as a tool of bourgeois dictatorship. And then in this long debate of whether to pass or not and why not, of course, the employer's side was against it, arguing that it's flawed, it's against the fundamental doctrinal principles of criminal law, and that definition of crime cannot include economic activity, etc. But finally it was passed in 1995, but with a compromise then that safety crimes were not included. So that was the last minute compromise that was made here. But then after another struggle, safety crimes were taken into under corporate criminal liability in 2003. So the same picture here again, and if we look at the left-hand balloon or circle there, we see that about 37 corporations are punished annually. And here we can see the same idea that mostly in cases of safety crime, individuals are punished, corporations more seldom. So in our data, we had 160 corporations punished, and then almost 300 individuals also were convicted. So in most cases, there was always the individual who was also punished and the corporations. And when the individuals were punished, the responsibility was mostly for the low and middle management, and only in less than 1/3 of cases, the top brass was punished in these cases. And what was astonishing was that the median, the typical fine here was 5,000 euros. So you remember the theoretical maximum was 850,000 euros, and the highest amount was 180,000, but the typical was 5,000 euros. And this was not explained by the size of the corporations. They were big, profitable businesses here. So they really used the courts, the very low end of the possible punishment. And here's interesting that there was one 500 euro fine, even if the theoretical minimum is 850. But what we did then is that in Finland we have this sort of progressive, it's progressive fining system to individuals. So it means that the court gives so-called day fines as the punishment to individuals, and then the amount of euros per day fine is dependent on how much you earn. So when the individuals were punished, they got between 20 and 29 day fines. And then we calculated, this is not implemented, the day fine system to corporations. There's another system of measuring the punishment. But we counted that what was it for corporations in our data? So we used the same logic as was used in punishing individuals, and since the average profit of the corporations was over 10 million, and the average fine was 10,000 euros. So calculating with this system, which would take too long to explain in detail, the average day fine the corporations got with the same logic as the individuals was 0.77. So it was very clear that the individuals, and especially the low management, was blamed more, or the weight of the burden of fines was much heavier for the shop floor than the corporate level. Also in this, when we analyzed the court cases, we could see that the court stated or talked about the role of the victim in these cases. And you could see also that when this was discussed in the court's decision, that the fine was lower than on average. And the common denominator of here when discussed the role of the victim and their fault was saving time. So in one case, the court stated that unlawful work method had become a common habit applied to several employees to save time, to work more effective. And the management had formally forbidden the procedure, but was nevertheless aware that this was normal practice. So this was stated in the court's decision, but still the final decision was that the lowest level management, the foreman, was punished, was sanctioned with a fine, and the corporation, which got 5,000 euros fine for this, and the top brass management was not punished at all. Then we also found that this corporate repeat offenders, this revitism, was totally silenced in the convictions. So 8 companies were convicted more than once, some of them 3-4 times during this 5-year period. But this was not taken into account by the courts when they decided on the amount of the fine. So this is really quite interesting because when it comes to individual crimes, repeat offending is taken into account when determining the punishment. But here it was totally, or there was one case where it was taken into account, but not in the other cases. So in some, these corporations and then the executives, the top brass, were largely successful in escaping the law's gaze, even though the whole idea of this corporate criminal liability and also the criminalization of safety crime was to put the liability where it belongs, to those who have possibilities to make decisions. Okay. To the concluding discussion, is it a mission impossible? Well, it seems a bit, if we think about social ordering, or if we think about those results, it seems a bit like I should say that it is a mission impossible, or it's a mission difficult. I would go rather than maybe, or let's look at first at this social ordering. So when we think about social ordering, it has been discussed in criminological literature a lot that and in police studies that the agents of the criminal justice system are charged with dealing certain type of disorder, crimes committed by individuals, crimes on the streets, etc. And they are institutionalized to a particular sense of order. And of course, this could be seen in this data. Also, what Frank Pierce has pointed out, that the sporadic acts of criminalization and prosecution are nothing more but a spectacle to give this imaginary impression by a social order, by this occasional punishment of the powerful. But I don't know, I don't want to be so deterministic. about what can be police property or property of the prosecutors. Is it so that it's only the, I mean, we know it is normally constituted around low status powerless groups, of course, we know that, but is it something that has to be, can there be some change in this? And now when I listen to Steve's presentation about what has happened in Britain, I actually feel even more optimistic about these figures I showed. Even if there are lots of problems, the situation is quite different here still. So I think as such, the fact that this corporate criminal liability was passed, okay, it might be then a very symbolic and just something reinforcing the imaginary social order, but still I see it as some kind of positive signal, is that it was passed, and then safety crimes were included, and then nowadays most of these cases are safety crime cases. Then there has been important Supreme Court decision which may cause a crack in the dominant individual ideology. And then it's about, can the mindset be changed? So this conceptual readiness of the agents of the criminal justice system, is it fixed? I don't think so. I think these attitudes to some forms of crime or social harm can be changed. Just as an example, we looked at regional differences in the implementation, or in which regions corporate crime punishments are have been given, and to what extent. And we see here little Pirkanmaa, the center of Finland district, which doesn't differ from, for example, Helsinki or Turku, in that there would be more businesses, but you can see that they have 28 convictions during that period. And if we look at recent statistics, they continue with this, that they have the most cases. And this is the reason for this is that in that region, the health and safety inspectors and the police work in close collaboration. They have had like successful cases, and they are eager to investigate these. They have training, and then I would say their mindset differs from other districts. So I think these little signals for me also tell that the mindsets can be changed. But of course, this would need a political will, and of course it's about resourcing and training, etc. So thank you. Please make questions if you have some.
Thank you very much for your presentation, for a great presentation. Actually, going back to one of your interview quotations, we can assume that the time frame for changing the police attitude would be 3 years, as one of your interviewees said, right? It took him 3 years to understand what safety crimes are. I can see, Roger, I think you are again indicating a question. If I can now, read this online language correctly, right? Are you raising your hand?
Yeah, but I think Julie raised his hand before me. Yeah?
Okay.
I actually have a question related to this for Steve because of this. So maybe it's better if you ask your question first.
Okay. Okay. So thank you very much. That was a really interesting presentation. So really going back to one of your slides in which you mentioned that really high-level executives are escaping the penalization of safety crimes, right? Basically, my question would be why? And also coupled to that question is and you alluded on that a little with your statistics, but again, there's clapping hands. Anyway, you alluded on who does the investigation of those safety crimes. So my question there, coupled to that, would be, who are those people normally who are investigating? Are it police officers? And do they get the training in how to investigate safety incidents? Because within the safety world, we apply specific methodologies to investigate the basic cause for an incident, why it has happened. And often enough, I've also participated in incident investigation. Often enough, the basic cause can be found by upper higher management, be it a procedure that was not updated or something not being signed off. So are those people getting the training they need to be able to execute such investigations? And a little bit about what you spoke about, an example of how employees might cause an incident by not following a procedure to win time, and that their high-level executives do nothing about that even though they know it. I think what happens often a lot in companies also is that there's always a pressure between keeping people safe and being productive within an organization. And the pressure of producing is often enough the higher pressure that comes to people, right? So yeah, that is always a challenge within companies. And so those two questions, if you mind. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'll try to remember all of them. You asked why not the top brass is not punished so often. Well, I think the police are quite important in the process, in that it's up to them also to collect evidence of the the top brass, and they find it, of course, quite complicated and difficult, and as was seen, they don't perceive them as they are wearing the ties and all, so it's hard for them to start their mindset, and also to put liability there is more complicated. It's easier if the low-level manager says, well, it was my fault. I mean, they often take the guilt, as one interview said, well, it's the low level who always take the guilt, and that can be something that is agreed upon also. So then the easy way out for the police is to put it there, and then if they haven't gathered evidence, of course, then it might be difficult for the court to do that. But of course, it's the basic, I would say, the basic perception of not being able to see the sort of cause and effect of the negligence of the top brass that inhibits them from perceiving, trying to build the liability. In terms of education, no, there is not much education, and I think that's, of course, the basic problem, is that there would be nothing. We have quite long police schooling, but still it's very much built on the traditional policing. And then there are some courses that the police can take when they already work as police. And actually, after this first research was published on policing, they made this manual to help investigate. because it raised a lot of discussion, this research within the police. But they get a lot of help from the health and safety inspectors, of course. They are totally dependable on how they investigate and support them. But the police still has the responsibility, and they can make the decisions see it as a crime or not. But they work closely with the investigators.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much.
Yuri, you wanted to ask a question too, right?
Yes, but it was basically making a little bit of a leap between the two. Maybe a question for Steve, because the UK as well, a number of years ago, 2007, I believe, introduced this Corporate Criminal Liability and Manslaughter Act. This was the main talk of Anna was about the introduction of such an act and how that potentially changes the dynamic. Steve, do you have any insight or information of how in the UK the introduction of that Corporate Liability and Manslaughter Act had an influence?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, many of us, I was part of a charity which was involved in we were campaigning for that new law to be brought in for about 12 years. There are many other groups, of course. I mean, that 12-year period, Anna also described this in some ways. In that 12-year period, the original proposals around corporate manslaughter and corporate homicide became weaker and weaker to the point when they were introduced in 2007. The reason for companies could be prosecuted for manslaughter before the law came in, but it was very difficult in practice to prosecute large, complex companies. So the new law was designed to make that easier. But by the time it came in, it looked like it was going to be no better than the existing law, which was already in place, which couldn't prosecute large companies. So since 2007, there have been 26 successful prosecutions under that act. So that's in the space of something like 14, 15 years. Only one of them has been against a company which we wouldn't class as a small company. It wasn't a large company, but it was a kind of medium-sized company, which may not have been successfully prosecuted under the previous act. There have been attempts to prosecute some large organisations. Either they haven't made it to court, or the prosecutions have failed very quickly. So, and then there are why might that be? Some people say, exactly to link into what Anna had to say, that the existence of the law and these handfuls of prosecutions under it are merely symbolic. I'm not sure if I agree with that necessarily, but it's very clear that it hasn't worked in any case.
Okay, thank you very much.
I have a question for Anna. If we can still go back to this outlier in one of your graphs of this particular police unit or region in Finland, where there was an interesting, let's say, optimistic and promising outlook on the future of safety crimes or how they are investigated. So you said that this cannot be explained by the number of businesses running in the region. Is there something else you believe can be quite specific? Is there maybe more focus on the training, more collaboration with other partners? I think you mentioned there was a good collaboration, but was that a collaboration with other criminal justice actors or health and safety actors? What are your other insights about this particular outlier?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's like you said that they work very closely together, and there's especially one very active health and safety inspector who informs about cases, successful cases, and then works with in collaboration with the police. And also, I think there has been like that when they have had successful cases, then it gives motivation also, both the police and the prosecutors are not very motivated to investigate if you get really, you know, if it doesn't go through, you know, your prosecution, or the fines are very small. So when they have been successful, it has also motivated them to investigate. So it's kind of a snowball effect there also in that region. And of course, the training and collaboration has influenced this.
My last question on this again. You mentioned that the research findings actually triggered some discussion and debate, and there was some change to the police manual. Was that like was it just like, I don't know, a mention of safety crimes or the importance of investigating them, or what was there like a proper workshop embedded into police education and training curriculum?
It was a special guide for investigating safety crime, not just a mention somewhere. But at the moment, I cannot say the latest figures on how much courses are arranged on safety crime investigation.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Okay, let me check, but I think we can move on to our third presentation. Professor Gabriele Landucci will be our next presenter.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. Shall I just share my presentation? I think.
Yes, please. I think yes, that's great. Yes, we can see your presentation. Fantastic.
Okay. So yeah, I'm confident you can hear me and see everything well. So again, thanks a lot for having.
Quite soft, actually, Gabriele.
Quite soft. So maybe.
Yeah, that made it a lot better.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Yuri, and thanks. Well, I wish I could be there actually, but nevertheless, we will have occasions in the future to meet again in The Hague as we share a common project. So, well, good afternoon, everybody, and again, thanks a lot. I try to give quite different perspective with respect to this key topic, and we'll just discuss some elements of a specific safety regulation that applies in Europe, and with particular reference to the process industry, as I'm a chemical engineer. And I do research in this specific area, but in this area, several other industrial sectors, as pointed out by the speakers, of course, human component is of fundamental importance. And I wish to reflect on the key aspects of the safety regulation related to the human factors and possible effects on risks. So please allow me first to give some overview of the concepts I normally use in this framework, just because if we do talk about safety at workplaces, we may have several kinds of risks that needs to be addressed. So I'll just spend some time on conceptualizing some discourse that bases the introduction of a specific regulation that is namely the Seveso Directive that controls the risk of major accidents. And so I want to talk about safety crimes related to this kind of accidents and the human component in this field, say how to deal with the human error, and to derive some conclusions, some proactive approaches. It is not meant to be a solution to this problem, but at the same time to be some indication how critical the human error is in this part, this component. So basically, we talked about several disciplines related to the world of HSE. That is not the British HSE Health Sector Executive. Actually, it's a set of disciplines that relate to the health, safety, and environment. As because a technological system like chemical factories or industrial system want to deal with share several complex interactions. as the plant, as the chemical facility, as the manufacturing plant is not isolated, but it shares interaction with the environment, people, with the economy. So technological system is a complex network of interactions, and well, if we really simplify this problem, we live with the technological system interacting with people, environment, and economy. And based on the impacts that we have, we frame the different disciplines I want to deal with, as well as assets, reputation, in terms of the common factor, but also people, considering the accidents and fatalities, injuries, and environmental impact. Just talk about environmental impact with arrow as a meaning in the sense that we have small severity because the technological system has emissions and towards the environment, so consider the pollution, and it has continuous impact. So we are not talking about this kind of safety, whether it's of course of utmost importance, but it's more related to the environmental part. Normally, what we consider health and safety for place, we consider some events that affect people, so the operators mainly, and they have a small impact because we considering typically injuries, but worst case 1-2 fatalities, and unfortunately the frequency is high. So those kind of accidents are treated considering statistical and data, and it's a rather different disciplines, and it's related to the operation. You see here a picture I took of a person entering into a tank. So it's this kind of events, and of course they are related to other kind of industrial accidents as well. But still, it's a very specific discipline. Spend this time just to highlight that the accidents that are covered by the specific regulation I'm talking about have a tremendous impact. So the arrow is large with respect to the previous arrows that I drew, and well, the credibility is low. So you see the dashed lines, and so industrial safety and this kind of disciplines of major accidents relates to some events that have a very high impact and low credibility. And still, we have safety crimes in there. We have the human component in there, and it's important that we familiarize with the concepts related to this discipline, just to see whether the human component is important and how to intervene with respect to that. And so we may have different perspectives on hazards and risks. There are several definitions. I just want to stress the engineering component, the engineering definition of risk, because it's functional with respect to the topic that we cover in the seminar, and especially with the human component. Well, the risk may be denoted several definitions. Somehow here we consider the elements related to the credibility of an expected outcome, and essentially the combination of severity, consequences, and the uncertainty expressed in terms of probability. And we also should define a different meaning of hazard and risk, because in technical disciplines, what I mean by risk is a combination of the severity of the impacts and the credibility of the events of the specific hazardous event occurring. And the hazard, well, in common language is not maybe it has a different nuance, but it has a deterministic nature, something represented the potential. So going faster on this introductory part, I just want to stress that we have two components, and we need a metric to measure the performance of a facility and to see whether the risk is acceptable or not, and also see the influence of the human component in that. And we may adopt observation, expert dominion, mathematical tools but the key outcome is to determine the credibility that a certain event may occur. And we have this structured procedure that also is applied in common safety analysis for workplaces and for operations. And so essentially, we need to identify what can go wrong, hazard identification, assessing the impact, the probability of the desired outcome, and then at the end, estimate the risk. Just don't want to bore you with formulas, but it's important that we familiarize just with one concept, that normally in any kind of work environment, and let's say to define the criminalization of the safety crimes, also in a generic field, risk is used as a metric denoting the level credibility of the undesired outcomes given an activity. And normally it's the product between a term denoting the consequences and a term denoting the frequency or say annual probability. And I use that because if you use a metric, then it's easier to frame where we are and how to distinguish workplace accidents and the framework I'm talking about. So in any work environment, you may have what are called conventional risks, where the frequency, credibility is high, but the impact, as I mentioned, is low. Then you have, with lower frequency, but higher impact, some specific accidents of the type of working environment, whether it's a chemical, factory or mechanical, aerospace, whatever. And then we have a final set, so we are focusing this afternoon together, at least but I'm focusing in this presentation, that are called events with low probability and high impact consequences. In the literature, you may find the term HILP, high impact low probability events. And this is the definition of the major accident, something that's you cannot wait to experience, because you need to prevent that before it happens. So normally in this part of the risk charts, you see events that are prevented by the observation of previous outcomes and statistics like the one presented by the colleagues. However, you can have a statistical measure accidents and risks, but you cannot wait to have an accident of such a big proportion, like a fire and explosion that may affect thousands of people. Therefore, in Europe, we experienced the evolution of specific regulation that defines some specific safety crimes that I want to discuss with you to see whether this regulation is effective and what is foreseen. And well, I found interesting to have a discourse on how this evolution, how this regulation evolved based on a severe accident that took place in the world since the very beginning. Say that this regulation was born at the end of the 70s, just because there were key outcomes, key accidents in the chemical industry that was expanding during these years. And the trigger was actually an accident that occurred in Italy in 1976, the Seveso accident that actually harmed people and the environment. There were no fatalities. But still there were very severe concerns about the safety status of the chemical plants. And well, it took some time to react, but at least some years afterward, the first Seveso directive was issued. It has several limitations, but at that time, the European Union didn't know such a limitation. And so, but it was important because for the first time, there were the mandatory development of emergency plans related to this kind of accidents and off-site emergency plans. The Seveso accident, local police is not, well, it's a different kind of police. It's called in Italian carabinieri. I don't know the translation in English, but they were totally unaware of the situation of toxic clouds spreading outside the plant. So at least Europe reacted on the key outcomes of this kind of accidents in Seveso. And so emergency preparedness was introduced. There were not explicit mention to penalties and most importantly, human components. But for the first time, we'll deal with this kind of accidents and to estimate the frequencies and the consequences for all the plants. However, during the 80s, there were paradigm, say, some key accidents that's essentially Bhopal is 1984. I'm confident that you know that thousands of fatalities were caused by that, again, a toxic cloud, and several elements led to the revision of Seveso 1. So there were two amendments. While the accident occurred, you had an amendment of the regulation, and most important, I think this is the key dates for Europe with respect to this legislation. It's 1996, the second revision of Seveso. I think that's the most important part is there. Since that time, Europe adopted this kind of regulation for the first time, introducing requirements for a safety management system and the introduction of major accident prevention policy. So I would say that's the first time the human component that starts from creating a safety climate and a safety environment for the workers started to be mandatory to be developed by law with criminalization. I mean, there were for the first time introduced specific penalties such as arrest or fees for not respecting the development of this policy. So if you are, my personal idea is that while you look at the accident and evolution of legislation, it's like that you see that's essentially you are reacting against something that goes wrong and maybe you didn't mention in the first regulation. It's just an impression. You see some specific kind of accident like the domino effect, just because this was this very huge accident in Mexico City, then domino effects became of concern. But still, after 2000, several other accidents occurred, even in the Netherlands. Maybe you remind Amsterdam. So Seveso directive was not amended. Let's say it was not changed, but there was an amendment considering the substances that exploded and affected the accident occurred in 2000. So it's still reactive, and just because the mining from pyrotechnic, other explosives, etc., were not included, and then a revision of the Seveso was issued. Up to the next level, that is the last revision. Now we have the Seveso third directive, and still after the most important accident in Europe, that's the most severe explosion occurred in UK. At the time, still the Seveso directive was valid there. Through the COMA implementation, they have a specific entity for the implementation of Seveso, and it's connected with the health safety executive that mentioned in the first presentation. And still we have a revision and a minor changes, but still I want to stress the standards for inspection of installation to ensure more effective implementation of the safety rules. And I think that something that emerged is the key role of inspections, normal workplace activities, but it's essential for this kind of legislation. It is mandatory that the regions, so local entities, create what is called technical committee for inspection. And so we have firemen, we have the Ministry of Environment, several entities that create a work group that inspects the plant periodically. So I think that one of the key elements that were introduced in Europe through this legislation is, say, the site inspection and structured procedure for that. At the same time, may consider that during the inspection you have a lot of paper, you will add a lot of documents, you may lose information, but it's important that they are effective and they contribute to the monitoring of the risk, and essentially also related to the human components that permeates this the risk of major accidents. And despite you don't see explicitly mentioned that part, I concluded that human error is just a part of a chain of events. It's just a part, but it's not the mere operator's error that that carries out a wrong operation, but should be related to the errors of the manager and the management at all level of the company, normally related to organizational and operational factors. Well, the common practice normally is to go with a prescription, and the act is, well, they are asked to be proactive in developing the policies against major accidents, but normally it's more a reaction with respect to that. However, if you look at the regulation, it appears that the human error might be prevented through the key involvement of the management. That's because the manager, we have a specific word in Italian, you have another one in Dutch, in France, etc. The site manager is a person that operates the factory of the facility and has a decision-making power. And you have specific criminal, let's say, penalties, as you see here, like arrest if major accidents occur, and you have deficiencies, fine, and so forth. And if you don't present the safety report, the lack of policy revision and implementation, you see that you may have this kind of, let's say, fees. And normally it is controlled through inspection. However, I do agree that it's not easy to then impose this to very big factories and big companies. Prosecution of that is done, of course, by police that has, let's say, based on the indication of the regional committee, may have the right to close and stop a facility, but it's very difficult to have finally accusation with respect to that. But still, this just highlights the critical aspects of safety management, and somehow, if you look at this chart, I very briefly highlight in this last part of the presentation how to propose a remedy or how to control the risk associated with this kind of accidents dealing with a human component. It's a different discipline. It's called human reliability analysis. I don't want to stress that too much, but at the end of the day, you see that those factors related to management affect the human error. If we try to have a systematic approach to recognize those factors, and we may directly have a result on the final risk. Just consider that in the risk definition I've provided, we have a static term that is related to the potential of the activity. If you have a refinery, you will have hazardous materials like gasoline and crude oil, whatever. So the potential of destructibility and impacts is still the same. What changes and we may intervene on is the frequency, and so the credibility that a mistake will occur. Controlling the training, assessing the safety of operation, and I'm just trying to make a specific example with respect to that. As because despite the legislation is quite sound, as I mentioned, formally the revision of safety reports is not dynamic, it's carried out once per year, inspection are not so frequent. To consider that risk is increasing due to a specific condition, a dynamic approach is what we may foresee, what we may have in order to control and mitigate those risks. So just try to make an example on how to deal with the human component with respect to the risk. Just summarizing a publication, I think I sent that to Dillon, but we'll share together with the presentation as well. This is just a summary, just because one of the possible elements that we need to adjust introducing the human component and managerial factors is what is called frequency modification or frequency tailoring of the risk component. In the literature, there are several publications and authors that's dealt with this kind of problem, and the idea is just to modify the frequency by multiplying by specific factors. You see there are possible deficiencies in the previous methods. University of Pisa, we developed together with SINTEF in Norway and the IO Center a specific methodology that's in brief supports the periodic update of risk with respect to the human components and factors, maybe based on a software still is under development to use the data gathering and reducing the complexity. And everything works if the company is committed. So the critical thing is to find companies that wish to have indicators to be monitored, to have a proactive attitude towards the safety management. And as you see here, this is just a qualitative representation, of course. You may have technical factors that contribute to the risk, but most important, the continuous improvement and development of HSE procedures may lead to decrement in risk. And so what I want to stress, just you may find in the paper more details, that the management modification factors based on indicators and collecting data from the field with a structured approach may contribute to the effective risk assessments and update. So just to highlight very briefly how it works, essentially we need to get some indicators from the field to score them and to define, say, to calculate those factors that modify the frequency. And indicators, see as an example afterwards, for management are related to the operational factors, training, for instance, or organizational factors. So the training, the workloads, the organization of the work, etc. And if you somehow have direct indicators continuously monitored time by time, you have a dynamic modification of the frequency. The idea is that you collect them, you score them, and then you assess the frequency. And we had a tiered approach from the indicator to the attributes that is associated with the modification factor based on a methodology developed by SINTEF itself. It's called the REWI methodology. It's an early warning indicator system based on resilience engineering. So I want to add too many concepts, but the idea is that you score the indicators and you measure from the field how many training sessions you had, how many people are involved in the hazard assessment procedure, if you are having some simultaneous operations, if the hazard identification is updated. So something that you can measure and that you can score. I think here you have in the presentation, it's not worth to read that. You can find that a lot of indicators that may be associated with the operational parts, like I mentioned, the house of training, and you can score whether you have a session of trainings or toolbox meeting, and then you can derive a contribution to the frequency modification factor. Same applies to organizational factors. You see here other examples. And practice, you convert some actual event that may occur in the facility. So here you see, for instance, during the years of operation, incremental over time, process plans, modification, procedures not up to date. Sometimes this may happen. You score all those events with a score ranging from 1 to 6, actually. And for each indicator, you have a score every month, every year, depending on how the company will react. And most important, you see here the factor of risk. Because according to the literature, despite you cannot physically measure the level of risk, you have a strong influence of the managerial factors. And at the end, you see the red line, the overall tailorization, the overall modification of frequency may lead even to 3 times the baseline value of risk, demonstrating that, yeah, human factor deal, let's say, have a great uncertainty entails. At the same time, they have a strong impact on the risk of critical installations like chemical factories, etc. So just concluding very briefly, I wanted to talk about safety regulation for a specific case, but essentially safety regulation for the process industry and its evolution, and how those safety crimes, well, for sure, improve the safety status of the chemical plants among Europe, but I would say that the evolution of the regulation is quite reactive. You have severe outcomes that were not foreseen before, and then you evolve the regulation. I found some strategies for preventing major accidents. It's important not to simply comply with law and prescription, but the proactive approach of indicators is one of the examples in the literature that we find to a available solution to control this kind of risk, and essentially related to human components that can only be controlled by the commitment of managers and operators. And this, thank you, and I will conclude.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Roger, yes, and Yuri. I think Roger was first.
Sorry, did you call my name?
Yes.
Sorry.
Did you indicate you want to ask a question, Roger?
Yeah, just one question. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I thought that the last part of your presentation was a little complex for me to understand. Can you please, in layman terms, explain to me what the frequency modification factor represents?
Yeah, just go back to the slide itself of the risk definition. That is maybe easier. Well, frequency modification factors apply to the frequency of a certain accident that entails a certain value of risk. So it has some consequences related to the hazard potential, and modify what is called the baseline frequency. That is the usual value that you get from standard frequency value that you use in conventional risk assessment. For instance, statistics of component failures, leakage from flanges, leakages from pipes. You have this kind of databases where you adopt what are called baseline frequency values that are fed into the risk assessment. However, a human component affects this kind of value that are normally in the literature. Okay, they are available in several databases. One of the most important one is issued by the HSE in UK, and it is called HR, hydrocarbon release statistic. And it is of value because it's homogeneous, because data are collected in a certain kind of restricted amount of plants. But if you operate a plant in Italy, if you operate in a certain facility in France, depending on the site-specific condition, this frequency is not anymore significant, because local factor, the condition of a plant may affect. Well, in the literature, you find some example dated back to the 2000. The API 581 is dated back to the 2000s, and they had frequency modification values that are not meaningful nowadays, because what happens once that standard was issued in America is not realistic. So they scored well something that nowadays is a common best practice. So they scored bad something that was really, really bad. So neglecting something that now in the process plants among Europe and in the world is not is not credible. So that's why there was a need of this review of frequency modification. So something that you multiply by the baseline statistical value of the databases, like the one that I mentioned before, to tailor frequency for the specific risk assessment.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yuri?
Yeah. I was actually also very much triggered by these, by the organizational, operational factors that go into this. So I was wondering, is that a potential guideline almost to establish a potential for negligence? So instead of just saying, you know, this regulation or this regulation you have to abide by, say, okay, we can identify what you should normally do, and the deviance from that might actually implicate liability and even criminal liability. But what is your view on that?
Yeah, thanks, Yuri. That's a critical point of this method. I have to answer with respect to that, because you see here we are scoring with good, medium, and bad, and as there were some default setting in case you didn't have such as information. Still, part of this answer is those are not mandatory. It's voluntary, taken by the company that is really committed to do the risk assessment in this way, because nobody tells you, okay, you should apply these indicators to tailor your risk. Normally, every consultancy company and private entity uses the standard database, and the competent authority may ask you, okay, show me how you consider the human factors in the policy, and this shall have a reflection on risk. I would say that this would help if you have a monitoring of this indicator and it reflects on the risk itself. The second possibility is when you find a company that is committed to select not 15 indicators, but maybe 5 that deem to be the most critical. So we still worked on that and found from SINTEF actually some indicators where we actually had the measurement, and for sure they were part of the risk assessment. At the same time, you can be prosecuted if you don't do the training and you don't involve the person. I'm talking about the Seveso directive in Italy, because I know well, or better say the implementation in here. And we have a specific article, Article 28 of our Italian implementation, stating that if you don't do the involvement of personnel, if you don't do the session on training for the safety record duly time by time with a certain period, you have a fine of say 15,000 euros and something like that. So I would say that some of the indicators in there are implicitly assessed by the national implementation of the law. And I can only really know only the Italian implementation to answer with respect to that. But I think here is like that you fulfill something at a higher level. It's not only not being prosecuted, but being part of a proactive approach. Maybe it's sort of a utopia with respect to that, but still, of course, you can be prosecuted for some specific aspects that are very similar, such as those factors. But if you apply this method, you'll be used for the risk assessment to show the competent authority that you are in line with the law.
There is one other question from another lecturer, Srijesh Krishnan. Perhaps, Gabriele, you've already answered that, but I'm not quite sure. Is this model of assessing risk when you measure the consequences and the frequency, is this applicable to only process industries, or can we use this approach to other industries as well?
Oh, it's risk definition is quite general, and basically you can apply the approach to any kind of industrial system, because this is a very traditional engineering risk definition. However, the specific method is tailored to the process industry in the sense that the baseline frequency value are for leakages, for accidents that permeate the process industry, where essentially you have hazardous materials. Manufacturing industry for sure should have other kind of statistics on failure rates of components, but and you should define other factors to tailor the frequency, but it's an approach that is multi-purpose, but those indicators are and those values, the numbers that are inside, are only related to the process industry, despite the risk definition is generic and applicable to any sector.
Steve, yes.
Yes, please.
Thanks, thanks, Anna. Thanks, Gabriele. So you've talked about the role of the company in your presentation, and you've talked about the role of the regulator, and you also alluded to the role of consultancies and so on, risk consultants and so on. What's the role, if there is one, what's the role of insurance companies in this kind of approach?
Well, specifically, they should consider the risk, of course, and this kind of evaluations. I'm not confident with respect to the kinds of insurance, say, insurance company rule with respect to that, because the industrial, let's say, process facility have assets of very big value, so it's a specific kind of insurance. I never considered that. It's not explicitly mentioned, I mean, in the regulation. So, and I don't know actually how the risk is assessed to get the insurance itself, because the risk that I'm talking about is somehow public. You have this evaluation for the land use planning around the chemical site, the process sites. So you cannot build a house very close. So you normally use this kind of risk concepts to define safety distances and define what is called the land use planning. And in every country, we have different methods for doing that. In Italy, it's different with respect to UK and the Netherlands and blah, blah, blah. So I really don't know how whether this kind of risk is then used or is not, or it's just the money value of the assets and some kind of risk related to the value itself and the potential accidents. So it's a point that is not developed in the regulation and the liability of the manager, what is called the plant responsible. So, but I can have I would say a follow-up with the plant operators just to see whether the manager has a specific insurance for the manager itself or the company against the major accident, because that should be for sure procedure and insurance companies respect to that.
Thanks, Gabriele.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more questions or indications of asking a question. So perhaps we can move on, Yuri, to the summary, if you are ready with the summary.
Well, it is, of course, I can be ready. It's very interesting how we had well, partially interesting, partially also obviously that was the aim that we were going for. Three very different perspectives, I would say, on this element of criminalization of safety crimes. Where Steve talked more about it from the point of view of the I would say the overall governance and the policy behind it, where Anne was concentrating more on the role of the police in this and policing. And where Gabriele almost took more of well, this risk identification, and he didn't talk about it from the point of view of the company, but to some extent, yeah, from the managers and the companies of how to engage with this. So I think that's it's very nice to see these three different perspectives. When we look at Steve, so he said at the start, well, I'm going to be talking about these four different things: current state of safety, the current state of affairs, better regulation, the trends in enforcement since 2010, and then specifically what's going on now with COVID times. I think what he very clearly established as well is how this idea, health and safety, the importance of health and safety in the prevention of social harm, and also, you know, the economic costs that accompany a lack of health and safety regulation, and then health and safety, even more than regulation, and he goes into that afterwards, enforcement, really. And you see that with the better regulation framework, where regulation was seen as more portrayed as burdensome, impeding innovation, but the really the perverse effect that would really happen was that the regulatory agencies were getting less and less budget. So you see less and less enforcement. You see that general decline in enforcement. Therefore, also the logical consequence of companies where they say, well, I mean, if we're not going to be, if this is not really going to be enforced, if we're not going to be monitored all that much, why should we invest in this? Because the real harm of it is probably, with social harm, with the economic harm, is more externalized. While you know, if we don't really invest in this, then the benefit of not investing in this is actually internalized. We as companies don't have to invest, don't have to put our money in this. And I think that's kind of a common theme, I think, for the second in the second presentation, and maybe an explanation of that is given in the third presentation of Gabriele, how both the first and the second speaker, so what Steve and Anne kind of indicated, well, the government and the idea behind this kind of regulation is that companies are actually lawful. Companies are actually do want to follow the law, and we don't really need this kind of additional stimulus monitoring for them to abide by these laws, except for a very small group. And yeah, there we need enforcement, and we need monitoring. While I think Gabriele clearly showed that instead of a lawful approach, companies in general follow what I would say an amoral approach. It's not immoral at all, but they look at the risks that are associated with this. And from that they make their decisions. And if they see that, so I mean, Gabriele concentrated on the severity and the frequency of things going wrong. I think in, you know, with the criminological aspect, additional criminological aspect is, you know, severity, frequency, and then also the risk of being caught. And that is the element that comes into the first and the second presentation. I mean, continuing what Steve said, you could actually see the consequences of all of this less monitoring, less enforcement in the current COVID-19 times because of the dismantling really of health and safety. So going to Anna, indeed, more this focus on police investigations. What I really like there is that the police itself really and public prosecution therefore as well, they're not used to this. I mean, safety crimes, their idea of what criminal activity is these probably more blue collar rather than white collar, and more about intentional acts. And that's, you know, in criminology and in how we look at what crimes are, that is the classic idea as well. The classic idea is that it's an intentional act to cause harm, one way or the other, and that needs to be taken on. Well, I would say, and then Anna actually kind of touched on that, but it's not the focus.
Sorry, could you say that again? Sorry, I couldn't.
That's actually Siri telling me that she can't follow me. I hope you can follow. You can follow me. Putting the watch down for a second. Sorry, what Anne was kind of touched upon, although it wasn't the focus of this particular seminar, is that also in criminal law we see an evolution here towards it's not just causing harm through an intentional act. It's also creating the circumstances through acts of omission where harm can occur. Harm in both an intentional and an unintentional way. I was actually, when I was listening to her, I was thinking about what is going on in the US at this point in time with two parents being charged for unintentional manslaughter because of the actions of their child who, you know, through very criminal intentional ways caused harm by engaging in a school shooting. But the parents are also being charged at this point in time for creating the environment in their home, not by criminal acts, but by not doing things that they were very probably supposed to be doing. By creating that environment, they also can be prosecuted. And I mean, it's on the one hand, I know this is still a different situation, but I was really triggered by it as well, that there is this evolution in thinking in criminal law as well, that it's not just intentional acts, it's also these acts of omission. I was very surprised when I was listening to the second presentation. I shouldn't have been, but I was at the same time, how the police culture actually ventures into this as well, because they're the ones who have to start investigations in this. And if they don't believe that these are really acts that should be criminalized, and because they're not real crimes and the people are not real criminals, and the victims should be blamed because they're being clumsy or they just have bad luck, and why now shoot this upstairs and blame the people above you, or blame the company. If that doesn't evolve, then we will be having again this additional problem of enforcement, not just monitoring, but also really enforcing enforcing these criminalizations of acts of omission. So this change of mindset is really necessary for prosecution, but also for the police, because they have to start with these investigations. And I was happy to see, I would say, that through more cooperation, with closer cooperation with health and safety inspectors, you can change this mindset. There is a possibility that this evolution will actually occur, but it's perhaps often forgotten because we're always thinking, oh, this should be criminalized and there should be monitoring as well, which is really important. But I would say once you go after the monitoring, after something happens, the idea that this needs to be taken seriously by those who need to investigate is really important. Coming to this, the third presentation, the risk perspective almost. As I said, the click was made for me that the missing element on how these kinds of activities or emissions of activities are being, how the acts of the companies are being perceived, is that companies look at it from a risk perspective. They don't look at it from a, do I need to follow the law? I should follow. No, they don't come from it. I should follow the law because I'm lawful. They come from it from the perspective, well, what is there? What are the benefits and what are the costs associated to not following this particular law? So it's about it's not a lawful perspective; it's an amoral perspective, calculation of risk. I did, like Gabriele, actually also emphasized this idea that a dynamic, proactive approach is necessary, that monitoring is necessary, that criminalization, as in then after the fact starting to punishing, is one link in a broader approach to making sure that that these kinds of incidents, accidents happen through human error happen less. So the two components really need to be looked at. And I also really liked, and that's why I asked the question as well, this operational organizational component, where I think certainly the second presentation showed us that it's perhaps also for police easier to look at the operational component and therefore perhaps concentrate on punishing those that the lower level managers and directly operational people, rather than the organizational components, which rest with the overall company policy, the overall company strategy, the high level managers. And I think there are perspectives there to be investigated further, to be looked at further, how more emphasis can be given in investigations towards those organizational factors. Last thing I was thinking about with the last presentation is that Gabriele really did concentrate on those high impact, low credibility, low frequency events, while the first and the second presentation, and therefore I think he also concentrated a little bit less on how likely is it that that through an investigation this will be found out, because they are high impact, there will be an investigation, and there will be consequences, I would say. The first and the second presentation concentrated more on high frequency, high credibility, but with relatively, maybe not for the people involved, but in a broader, from a broader view, low impact, low severity kind of events. And perhaps it is time, also from a European perspective, also from a regulatory perspective, to concentrate on those a little bit more as well. Maybe a call towards the European level to not just look at the Seveso ones. And I'm very clear, I want to say not just look, because it is important to look at those, but also look to the low impact but high credibility kind of events, because that is where companies will probably also be saving their money. That is where they will say, well, you know, they might be high frequency, but we don't really notice the impact all that much. Perhaps it is time to also concentrate on those in accordance and following, I would say, the presentations of both Steve and Anna. I hope that was a good overview of what has been going on at this point in time. I missed so many things. Well, I didn't miss them. I didn't go into so many things because then I wouldn't be summarizing. I would just be repeating everything. I would say interpret the things that I haven't mentioned as me wanting to be as brief as possible and not thinking that they're not important, because everything that was said here by all three speakers is certainly important, and I hope everybody who was present here can take this with them and implement them either from a research perspective or in their more daily practices from an operational perspective as well. Thank you, and I will give the last word, I would say, to Anna. Yeah, to Anna actually. Anna actually, yeah, correct. Not Anna, but Anna.
Thank you very much, Jori, for excellent summary and conclusion of this event. I would like to thank once again our speakers for their precious time, for their commitment to this event, and I will be in touch with you afterwards. But I would also like to thank the audience, all the participants who join us today, my colleagues from SSMS, students from SSMS, but also from Leiden University. Thank you for your questions and your comments. That means a lot to me, and thank you that you also found time in a highly busy period right now also. So thank you very much for this. As I said at the beginning of the event, this recording will be made available afterwards, as well as speakers' presentations and some indication for additional readings and publications. So thank you once again. I wish you a wonderful evening and the rest of the week. And thank you once again very much, everybody, for your time. Thank you also, Dillon, a person behind the scene who also helped a lot with the organization of this event. He also contributed a lot to the he spent a lot of time trying to arrange the hybrid event on campus. Unfortunately, it didn't go ahead. So thanks to him as well. Again, and I hope that we will be able one day to meet in person and celebrate and continue this discussion. Thank you once again, and have a lovely evening, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.